Thank you, Ray, for that kind introduction. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. Is the sound all right? Yeah? Good. So, I've done some writing in my time on Wittgenstein and physics, but what I've been asked to do here this morning is a little bit wider than that. I've been asked to do what Wittgenstein might call scene setting, or what Frankie Howard might call the prologue. I'll be back later to wrap up, but what I'm seeking to do with this talk this morning is to give us a vital part of background, scene setting, in order for us to be able to make the move more specifically, if you like, into thinking about Wittgenstein and physics. So as Ray says, I'm going to be talking about science and scientism. Because Wittgenstein's attitude to science, we might say, was Janus-faced. On the one hand, for instance, he was trained as an engineer, and he was a huge admirer, as I'm sure we'll be hearing during today, of a number of scientists, especially certain physicists, who he took, one might say, as role models, and who were substantively influential on his philosophizing. But on the other hand, repeatedly throughout his career in his work, he criticizes the tendency to apply the scientific method in culture more generally, or in relation to thinking about religion, or in philosophy itself, perhaps most crucially of all. So what gives? How do we resolve this apparent superficial tension between a great admiration for science, and perhaps especially for certain physicists, and on the other hand, a great concern repeatedly manifested centrally in his work about, if you like, the influence of science? Well, I've perhaps already telegraphed the outlines of my answer. Wittgenstein was all in favor of science, but he was extremely concerned about the overreach of science, which he thought was characteristic of a civilization like ours. He was very concerned about scientism, the ideology that suggests that the application of scientific method, the so-called scientific method, is the thing to do whenever one is seeking to gain knowledge, what one might call even science worship. Wittgenstein thought the application of the scientific method outside its proper home was extremely problematic. The view, he thought, that science is the only legitimate mode of understanding or knowledge gathering was, he thought, wrong, and a peculiarly modern obsession, and particularly disastrous in the field of philosophy. A lot of my work over the last 15 years has been dedicated to explicating this double nature of Wittgenstein's relationship to science. So, for example, in my book Kuhn, I sought to give for the first time a Wittgensteinian reading of the great philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, explicating how Wittgenstein and Kuhn are all about understanding the distinctive, impressive nature of science, and have been completely misunderstood insofar as they are claimed sometimes to be opponents of science. In my more recent book, with the modest title, There is No Such Thing as a Social Science, I argued against the overextension of the concept or the category of science, and laid out how Winch and Wittgenstein contest the very category of social science, and similarly of psychology as a science, how they regard it, if you will, as a kind of category mistake. And then most recently in my book, Wittgenstein Among the Sciences, which is a detailed engagement with a critique of scientism across various disciplines, I discuss in detail most of the quotations that are to be found in your handout, which I would now like to draw your attention to. And really what I want to do now for the next 15, 20 minutes or so is just to work through these quotations with you, and then to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion of them and of what I've said, which I think there will be plenty of such questions, and then hopefully we'll be, if you like, set up for the day. So let me start with quotation number 1 there. Somewhat obscure quotation, but a quotation that I like very much. I like it because it reveals an aspect of Wittgenstein's interest in science which is, I think, not widely understood. As we shall see during today, Wittgenstein is profoundly influenced by certain physicists, but he also believes that physical science may itself benefit from a closer engagement with philosophy. So, philosophy asks, why does it have to be thus? Why should it not be thus? Philosophy asks us, if you will, to consider radical alternatives to the view into which we have been educated or instructed. It challenges dogmas. And this is necessary when science is in trouble, or as Kuhn would put it, in crisis. Wittgenstein says questions like these are beneficial in science because they clear away prejudices. And this idea of clearing away prejudice is absolutely focal to Wittgenstein's understanding of what philosophy is, as brought out, for example, very clearly in the later work of Gordon Baker, who resided just across the street there in St. John's College until his untimely death. And Wittgenstein thinks useful also in science, especially, Kuhn would say, when that science is at a point of potential crisis, when the existing paradigm is malfunctioning, when the questions we've been educated into are themselves becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Secondly, a passage which is in Culture and Value, but nevertheless not as widely known as I think it should be. Science, enrichment and impoverishment. What does Wittgenstein mean by this somewhat gnomic phrase? Enrichment, Wittgenstein takes for granted that science is about enriching our understanding and knowledge of the world. This is just completely obvious. Right? He doesn't even go on to explicate it in the rest of the passage. What he goes on to explicate is something about what he means by impoverishment. So here we have the Janus face I referred to earlier, right here, very explicit. Science, enrichment and impoverishment. The good side and the bad side. So what's the impoverishment? The one method, this is scientism, yeah? This is science taken as the one legitimate method. The one method elbows all others aside. Compared with this, they all seem paltry, preliminary stages at best. So this is a nutshell critique of scientism. They seem like preliminary stages at best. This is the notorious idea of disciplines which are not the physical sciences as young sciences. What else could they be? Right? What else is there other than proper sciences and disciplines which are on the road to becoming sciences? And Wittgenstein thought this was a completely disastrous understanding of other disciplines, and he went into great detail in particular on how it was a disastrous understanding of psychology. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that there's something different, that they're not to be assessed with the ideal of science always hanging over one, distorting one's way of seeing. That the kind of understanding or knowledge or indeed wisdom that one gets from the arts or from meditation, contemplation, or from philosophy itself ought not to be assimilated to the kind that one gets from science. This resistance to over-assimilation is itself a central part of Wittgenstein's resistance to scientism, as we will shortly see in a little more detail. Now turn to quotation number 3, and I'm just going to give you a moment to read that for yourselves, as it's a little bit longer. I hope you'll agree with me that this is a beautiful passage. The observant among you will have spotted that it's not actually by Wittgenstein, unlike all the other quotations. It's by Heinrich Hertz, major physicist of the time, and a great influence on Wittgenstein in ways that we could discuss in detail and that I will now briefly outline, and perhaps we'll come back to later. This passage expressed for Wittgenstein a model of what it was to philosophize in the fashion after which he wished to philosophize. One reason I think it did is simply that it is a beautiful passage. And Wittgenstein thought, and this is an interesting thing which I think is under-discussed, that there was an artistic character, if one might put it that way, to great scientific writing and thinking, and to real philosophizing. He thought this was something they had in common, and I think he would be distressed by the way that quite a lot of writing in the tradition of so-called analytic philosophy since his time, a tradition which he allegedly began, does not, in my view, exhibit this artistic character, and indeed thinks that to be properly scientific requires the opposite of anything artistic or creative. Why was this passage so crucial to Wittgenstein? Why was it so influential on him? Well, really, it provides a key for Wittgenstein's so-called therapeutic method in philosophy, especially this final sentence. When these painful contradictions are removed, the question as to the nature of force will not have been answered, but our minds, no longer vexed, will cease to ask illegitimate questions. So it's a question of not seeking to ask the questions which we've been given or which have been imposed upon us, but of questioning those questions, of seeing a way beyond those questions, of seeing a mode of presentation, perhaps a perspicuous mode of presentation, that enables one to do what one wanted to do without having to be cramped by the questions which had been, up until that point, the questions that seemed to need to be answered. Philosophy, unlike much science, though not obviously unlike all, not some of the deepest, most creative science, the kind of science that he saw in somebody like Hertz, science which we might even call philosophical physics. Philosophy is not about answering questions for Wittgenstein. It's a disaster for philosophy to model itself on what Kuhn called normal science, on research that centers upon answering questions, the terms of which are unchallengeable. And with that little sort of nod to the contemporary discourse that dominates the Academy of research and research agendas and so on and so forth, I do mean to be suggesting that the Wittgensteinian spirit of philosophy is inimical to the way in which the Academy nowadays, its knowledge-gathering practices, are supposedly neutrally set up. The idea of having a research agenda, the idea of having a set of questions which you start out with and which you can map from the beginning something about how you're going to go about answering, right? This is an idea inherited from normal science, the category of normal science. It's an idea which is inimical to Wittgenstein's philosophizing, and I put it to you what is, in fact, obvious if one knows anything about the actual way in which bodies like the Arts and Humanities Research Council have been modeled upon bodies in the sciences, that there's something very problematic here about the way that the humanities find themselves unable to stand up on their own 2 feet and are, going back to quotation number 2, more inclined to view themselves as preliminary stages at best, unable to take away the overpowering cultural power and icon of science from the way that they proceed. So what Wittgenstein took from Hertz, most crucially, I think, was an understanding of a beautifully clear model of the kind of thing he sought to do in philosophy and that he thought more of us should seek to do in philosophy. And it's striking that he took that from Hertz's book, Principles of Mechanics. Quotation number 4, this is a short remark from which Wittgenstein considered using as a motto for the philosophical investigations. Many of you will know it from King Lear. Why was he so struck by this remark? I'll teach you differences. Well, this takes us into the heart, really, of Wittgenstein's concern about the grave risk of over-assimilation on philosophy, and this is a key to his philosophy. Wittgenstein was profoundly concerned about the understatement or underestimation of what we might call, using a different idiom, the ontological difference between, for example, numbers and infinity, or numbers and numerals, between mind and body. We're often told that Wittgenstein thinks that the dichotomy between mind and body is one that has to be overcome, and there's a certain sense in which this is profoundly true. But it's also true that for Wittgenstein, and a great passage on this, if any of you wish to go into this in more detail, is Philosophical Investigations 339, which I haven't really got time to go into with you here now, but I'll just mention it, 339. Wittgenstein also thought there was an important sense in which the categorical difference, if you will, between mind and body was typically understated in philosophy, including even sometimes by so-called Cartesian thinkers, because he thought that the way in which mind was discussed actually made it look too much like a form of body, or the two as two forms of one underlying thing, two substances, two kinds of things. That is to underestimate, to understate the difference between the two, the grammatical difference, if you will. And similarly, Wittgenstein thought that the difference between the human world and the physical world tended to be underestimated or understated by philosophy. This is what I've explored in my There Is No Such Thing as a Social Science and in the more recent book. This is a key theme of Wittgenstein's work, a key, as I say, to that work. He wants to help us to overcome an over-reliance on the idea of science that fosters this underestimation. Wittgenstein thought that the ideal of science, inappropriately overexpanded or over-projected, tended to encourage one to assimilate things that shouldn't be assimilated, because one sought to put them under a theory which could unify them. Turn to quotation number 5. Marvelous quotation from the Tractatus, a lovely contrarian passage. At the basis of the whole modern view of the world lies the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomena, as though the laws of nature actually had themselves a kind of power. So people stop short at natural laws as something unassailable, and as it were, overawed by them or almost worship them, as did the ancients at God and fate. And they are both right and both wrong. But the ancients were clearer, insofar as they recognized one clear terminus, insofar as they thought that talk about God or fate was not an attempt to offer something which was correctly characterized as an explanation all the way down of what was happening. The ancients were clearer insofar as they recognized one clear terminus, whereas the modern system makes it appear as though everything were explained. I like this passage very much. It suggests how science, if projected beyond its home, involves the opposite of progress. Science, the quintessentially progressive human activity, carries with it inherently the risk of a hubristic fantasy of epistemic domination, which can segue into a hubristic fantasy of material domination, which I think is roughly what we have in our world today. And finally, quotation number 6, long, famous quotation from the later Blue and the Brown books. I'll read this out with you. Our craving for generality has as one source our preoccupation, one key source, our preoccupation with the method of science. I mean the method of reducing the explanation of natural phenomena to the smallest possible number of primitive natural laws, and in mathematics, of unifying the treatment of different topics by using a generalization. So this quotation, quotation 6, if you like, brings together what I sought to say in quotation number 4, where I emphasized Wittgenstein's concern about over-assimilation, and quotation number 5, where I emphasized Wittgenstein's concern about overreaching explanationism, as we might call it. 4 and 5 unite in a concern about explanationism and about over-assimilation, joining in the habit of theorizing, where theorizing is inapt or inept. So, philosophers constantly see the method of science before their eyes and are irresistibly tempted to ask and answer in the way that science does. This tendency is the real source of metaphysics, strong claim, and leads the philosopher into complete darkness, another strong claim. Metaphysics as, if you like, super science. I want to say here that it can never be our job as philosophers, to reduce anything to anything, or to explain anything, full stop. Right? That's not what a philosopher does. Philosophy really is purely descriptive. And these ideas are elaborated in more beautiful detail in long passages, as many of you will be aware, in the heart of the philosophical investigations. So I think that passage number 6 there, expresses quite clearly and brings together a number of the threads from what I've sought to say from this handout, of the way in which Wittgenstein while an admirer, as I've suggested, of science, can be and rightly should be viewed as a despiser of scientism. So, to draw towards a close, that was then. This is what Wittgenstein wrote in his time. What about now? Has the culture absorbed Wittgenstein's critique? Or alternatively, have we outgrown the critique? Well, unfortunately, it seems to me that the answer to both of those questions is a very clear no. Today, scientism is as strong as ever, arguably stronger as other cultural powers such as art, nature, religion have waned. Someone who has gone into this in great detail in recent years in a very impressive way, absorbing some of Wittgenstein's influence, is Ian McGilchrist, whose book, The Master and His Emissary, some of you will be familiar with. And if we think about contemporary phenomena such as the geek movement, the skeptics in the pub fraternity, the growth of humanism. I'm not saying anything against humanism, but there does seem to be a correlation between the views of some humanists and atheists, and a kind of veneration, which I think is unhealthy and that Wittgenstein would have thought is unhealthy, of science. In the movement towards evidence-based everything, and also in the way in which it can seem to us impossible to resist this movement. Who could possibly be against evidence? I mean, isn't it obvious that if we're going to answer any question, then what we need to have is the evidence? Well, it's only obvious because of the extent to which our culture has gripped us in a vice of scientism and has made it impossible for us to consider the importance of phenomena such as ethics or precaution, which are not contained within the technocratic confines of what's allowed to be called the evidence. In, as I described earlier very briefly, the structuring of the academy to reflect scientific norms, for example, the very concept of research, which is deformative of what goes on in the humanities, and especially in philosophy. In our technocratic governance culture more broadly, in the sneering at traditional and indigenous cultures, at those living on the land, at wisdom traditions, at religion and spirituality, at art considered as something other than just entertainment. And this was profoundly concerning to Wittgenstein. He thought that it was becoming more and more difficult for us to understand, to comprehend that art, that music could actually have something to teach us, rather than just be something pleasant that we used on our evenings off. In all of these, scientism is alive and very well. Wittgenstein provides us with the greatest repository of wisdom for countering it. Only if we accept his invitation to overcome science worship will we be able to bring properly into focus his multifariously positive relationship with physics, a relationship evident, for example, in quotes number 1 and number 3 on my handout. And thus I think that understanding Wittgenstein's complicated relation to science and to the idea of science, including his various affinities to it, and his profound resistance to its overvaluation, is a crucial prequel, if you will, to adequately figuring his relationship to physics. Thank you.
Right, we've got time for questions. Any questions? Yeah, right at the back.
Hi, Rupert.
Hi, Catherine.
I've got lots of, thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation very much. But I've got lots of questions. I'm just going to ask one right now, which is...
We have lots of time, which is good.
Yeah. What are the quotation marks doing around the phrase purely descriptive?
Well, you're the Bakerian, you tell me. What do you know? Seriously, what do you think they're doing?
I'd have to see the passage in its context to know whether it's simply referring to something he said earlier or whether there's something more in it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the blue and the brown books with me. I'm not sure I can really answer the question. Does anyone have a clue? What Catherine is partly alluding to is that one of the ways in which Wittgenstein's writing is challenging is that, especially in his later years, especially in something like the blue and the brown books, which is written in very clear prose, ostensibly, especially in the blue book, Wittgenstein actually is using certain diacritics in a way which actually complexify the thing a lot more than can appear at first sight. very notably his use of italics and of single quotations, which are used very, very roughly and crudely at a first approximation as a kind of a scare quote. If one isn't clear about the way that these diacritics are used in a more or less consistent way in his work, it can lead one into serious misunderstandings. This point is documented at length in Gordon Baker's book, Wittgenstein's Method, Neglected Aspects, of which I, like Catherine, am a great admirer. Well, Catherine edited it, so obviously she's a great admirer of it. And so unless one gets right what Wittgenstein is doing with these diacritics, one can seriously understand what he's doing with concepts like grammar and essence and so on. Often his use of double quotes is somewhat more straightforward. As Catherine implied, it often means something like simply a quote, or kind of referring to something that he said earlier, or something like that. So I wouldn't imagine that there's anything hugely complex going on here, but I'm afraid I didn't take the trouble to look that up in relation to the context, and I don't have the book with me. So if anyone has a particular thought about what this purely descriptive, in quotation marks, double quotes means, I'd be grateful to hear it. Is somebody there? Was that a...
Hold on, I think you're suggesting that...
Sorry, can I just stay on this for a second? Because I think you're going to ask a different question. Does anyone have anything to say about this purely descriptive in double quotes? No, maybe we'll come back to it.
Yeah. I may be wrong, but I think you're sort of somehow suggesting that art is somehow in decline, somehow not what it was, and I couldn't disagree with you more, frankly.
I think you may have misunderstood. I'm not claiming that art is in decline. I'm claiming that it's difficult for, I mean, we could have a long discussion about whether art is in decline. I think there are ways in which I would be inclined to say it is, and other ways in which I'd be inclined to say that it isn't. For example, I think we're in an age of extraordinary flourishing of film and television, including in popular culture. Quite serious art is being produced in popular culture on television, I think, which is almost unprecedented.
Well, art always was popular culture, and it's only sort of gets sort of calcified.
Yeah.
Opera used to be popular culture.
Yeah.
I mean, but people look down on popular culture.
No, I don't look down on it at all. But my thought is that a lot of people, especially in places like this, do look down on it. And are not open to the thought that, for example, when I talk about, as I sometimes do in my writing, about popular films, there is a kind of widespread assumption among critics and academics that any film that is popular, because it is popular, must inherently be artistically weak. And this seems to me an appalling assumption, and quite often the inverse of the truth. It seems to me that some very popular works are popular precisely because they are artistically strong. But look, this is all really orthogonal to what I was saying. What I was suggesting was that we have a problem in relation to art, or if you will, the concept of art nowadays, which is partly, well, it's not entirely orthogonal to what I just said. It's partly that there's been a kind of connection drawn between art and entertainment and between art and commercial interests, which makes it difficult for people to see the possibility that to Wittgenstein was absolutely obvious that the arts offered, if you will, an independent and vital and deep bottom-up mode of understanding, expressing, exploring the human condition, the nature of life, everything, philosophical questions. My thought is that the growth of scientism is one major reason why it's become difficult for us to get clear about the extent to which it's possible, as I profoundly believe, and as I think you profoundly believe, it's possible to see the arts as an independent, self-standing form of understanding as well as of expression, not as something like a preliminary stage or as something that we simply do on our day off. Yeah. So I think
I just argue that it always has and still is an expression of an understanding of the human condition, but there is this association with commercialization because there always has been, because
Yeah.
artists always needed patrons.
Yes.
It's just part of the
Yeah,
process.
sure. Yeah, no, I don't think we're really disagreeing. My concern is that scientism, technocracy, etc., makes it more difficult for us in the broadest sense, to appreciate the art and the arts in the way that, as you're saying, we ought to.
Okay, we do have quite a lot of time, but we've got a queue now of 7 people. Starting with you, I think. Yeah, I think.
Isn't it something to be regretted that Wittgenstein, in his battle against scientism, rejected the route of deepening the history, our knowledge of the history of philosophy and our knowledge of the history of metaphysics and changes in metaphysics within philosophy? Because the method that Wittgenstein seems to approve of in his attack on scientism is just to reject certain kinds of questions and certain kinds of approaches. And so the therapy is to reject those approaches and to try to develop a coherent model without all of those approaches. But it seems in the end that it's unsatisfactory. Wittgenstein's approach is unsatisfactory because it leaves out so much of the history of philosophy and the history of metaphysics.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. There's so much to be said in reply to it. Let me have a go. So one important thing I would say in reply is we should always remember that insofar as Wittgenstein rejected metaphysics, he didn't do it in the way that the logical positivists did, by saying, "Oh, this is just nonsense. It's just rubbish. Just forget about it." On the contrary, he had the profoundest respect for these great mistakes and myths and tendencies of human being, and he expresses this over and over again. He thought that the roots of metaphysics were as deep as the roots of philosophy, and as deep as the roots of many of the most fundamental issues that confront human beings. What he thought was that the attempt to solve the apparent questions that metaphysicians ask, as I elaborated, for example, in relation to quotation number 3, that was the problem, and he sought to offer a new method or set of methods or methodology which could, in a very different way, give us peace or liberation and so on and so forth. Now, it's very true to say that Wittgenstein himself didn't do a great deal of exploring, certainly not in a scholarly fashion, of the history of metaphysics, which he could have done. It wasn't, I think, really his temperament, and his temperament was more. His inclinations were more tied up with seeking to identify what he sometimes called a picture or even the essence of a phenomenon, and to engage with that. But I think it's quite striking that many Wittgensteinian philosophers, perhaps especially in recent years, including some in this room, have done exactly what Wittgenstein didn't do. And in my opinion, it's especially striking that Wittgensteinian philosophers who've been influenced by the later Baker and who are part of the new Wittgensteinian school, or the resolute reading school, which I helped to bring to the attention of the world with my new Wittgenstein collection in 2000, have been at the forefront of this. So to give a few examples, we have, of course, Catherine Morris and Gordon Baker drilling right into and seeking to understand and, in a certain sense, recover the philosophy of Descartes, who is always taken by Wittgensteinians, or by so-called Wittgensteinians, to be the sort of model of a sort of bad metaphysician who we simply sort of oppose or reject, or something like that. And Stephen Mulhall has done this again and again, especially in recent years. Cora Diamond has done this kind of recovery operation with a number of philosophers, including Frege and Berkeley. Her remarks on Berkeley at the opening of The Realistic Spirit are, I think, a profound engagement with his engagement with metaphysics. James Conant and John McDowell and others have done this with regard to Kant. Myself and one or two others have done it with regard to Hume. What's going on with this? I mean, I think that one of the things that's going on is that a lot of Wittgenstein's criticisms of metaphysics and of scientism turn out not necessarily to be criticisms, at least not head-on criticisms, of, roughly speaking, the great philosophers or the canonical philosophers. They tend more to be criticisms of those philosophers, interpreters, or scholars, or doctrines which get called things like Cartesianism, even if they don't necessarily get to the heart of what Descartes was really trying to do. So what I think we new Wittgensteinians and post-Bakerians and so on are seeking to do here is, if you will, to respond to the very well taken question that you've asked, and to seek to show what is a tenable Wittgensteinian relation to the great canon that we've inherited, and to show, I mean, one way of putting it would be this, to show that actually many of the great philosophers, including people like Berkeley and Kant, have not necessarily been, as Wittgenstein might put it, as much of a metaphysician as the tradition has taken them to be. That would be one way of putting it. But you can go either way. You can say, well, what Wittgenstein's really doing, according to these thinkers, is showing us if you like, the positive side rather than just the negative side of metaphysics. Or you can say that what he's doing, and I tend to prefer to put it this way, is showing us that actually metaphysics is, as Wittgenstein used the term, is not so much the preserve of the great philosophers, and more, unfortunately, the preserve of second-rate thinkers.
I'm going to try and get through the queue.
Can I just ask a very quick supplementary?
Go on, give him a quick supplementary.
Is there a neo-Wittgensteinian who has done a recovery operation on Hegel?
Not really, although I think that Paul Franks may have done a little bit, but others in the room may know more than I do. I really don't know much about Hegel. Yeah, there's probably more work to be done, I'm sure.
There's a lady in the second row who answered the question you a long time ago. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I suppose, yeah, you know the third quote from Hertz?
Yeah.
You sort of gave the impression that the question about what is the nature of force is a kind of normal, conventional sort of scientific question that might be forcing scientists through their education. But I sort of thought that one of Hertz's main points in that passage was to actually unmask this question as a kind of not really a scientific question at all. It's actually what Wittgenstein might have called a philosophical disquiet arising from a sort of chaotic extension of the use of the word force in different regions, and then, you know, so actually, I mean, so what Hertz is really doing there is philosophy in Wittgenstein's sense, would you say?
No, I agree. I totally agree. That's why I introduced this term philosophical physics in my attempted exegesis of the passage.
I guess, yeah, I just wouldn't call it physics, I'd call it
Well,
in
the reason why you introduced that term is because of the way that Wittgensteinians sometimes use the term philosophical psychology to talk about what Wittgenstein does with regard to psychology, which I think is of a broadly similar nature to what he excavates from Hertz here. So, but it's just a kind of possible terminological suggestion. I think we're really in agreement.
Okay, Graham.
Yeah, enjoyed your talk very much. And if I could ask you a question from the point of view of the humble modern physicist who's not a philosophical sophisticate. Looking at the quotation 5 from the Tractatus, from a modern point of view, so people stop short at natural laws as something unassailable. Well, from the modern point of view, I think it's fair to say that we would never say any natural law was unassailable because it's the best we have at any time and it will be improved upon later. That's one thing. I just want clarification. The second thing is it says that where the modern system makes it appear as though everything were explained. If he said explicable there, then I would have no problem with that. But when he says were explained, I would appreciate your clarification.
Okay, well, I think your two questions are really one question, and I think that there may not. Well, it'll be interesting to see whether there's a disagreement between us or not. I think that the reason there might not be a disagreement is I think what Wittgenstein is suggesting here is not necessarily that people think, right, now we've arrived, now we've got it, and there's never going to be any further scientific clarification or extension or explanation or whatever. I think what he thinks is people think something like, if we happen to have got it right, if it turns out that in the future this law is going to remain intact, then we will have produced something unassailable, which makes it look as though everything were explained. That, I think, is his concern. So it's not some kind of assertion that scientists mistakenly think that they definitely have arrived at the end of the research frontier and that there's nothing beyond. His concern is, if you're thinking to yourself, well, the law that I've come up with, it may be the truth and it may stay intact indefinitely into the future. And if that's the case, then it'll be something unassailable and something that will have explained everything. Now, if you agree with that, which I don't know if you do, the reason we might still disagree is that you might, I don't know, want to go on and say, yes, but if we get a complete grand unified theory, then we actually will have arrived at something which really, by its very nature, will have succeeded in producing something unassailable, which will have explained everything. I think Wittgenstein would have actually been skeptical of the very ambition to produce the grand unified theory, which a lot of physicists are questing after as a holy grail, by no means all these days. The ambition of a grand unified theory might be quite a good way, I think, of describing what Wittgenstein is concerned about physicists having. And in that case, obviously, it's clear that the point is, it's not that people think they've got it already, but they think that if they did have it, then they would have something unassailable which would have explained everything.
Okay, there were two questions at the back. Yes, I think yours was the first. Yours, yeah.
Is the difference between science and other forms of scholarship or knowledge exaggerated by relying too much on what scientists say they do, as opposed to what they actually do?
Yes. No, just to say, just a tiny bit of elaboration on that. And this is one reason why I think that Kuhn is important and why it's helpful to see Kuhn through a Wittgensteinian lens. Until Kuhn came along, really, far too much of the philosophy of science was based around, if you like, abstract theories, often little more than speculations or sort of anecdotal reflections on one particular form of science, which were then kind of expanded into some kind of alleged conception of what the whole of science is. So yeah, we have to actually look at the practice of science, and then we will see it, and then we'll be far less likely to be misled. So Wittgenstein was in this sense, I think, well, obviously, a kind of foundational figure for contemporary post-Kuhnian philosophy of science, but also for the sort of ethnography, sociology, and anthropology of science, which has flourished in the last generation or two.
It's impressive that he manages to be post-Kuhnian before Kuhn.
Yeah, he does that to a lot of people.
Right at the back.
So you suggested at some point that maybe he doesn't think of psychology as a natural science. But in the Tractatus, there's this remark that psychology is no more closely related to philosophy. Philosophy is no more closely related to psychology than to any other natural science. So there it appears that he does think, and then he says the same with Darwin as well, that he does think of psychology. So do you think he changes his view later? And related to this, in that context, he's talking about philosophy as a series of elucidations, which you've written about. And I was wondering how you think that relates to the so-called purely descriptive. So that which elucidates versus that which describes.
Okay, so on the first question, yes, I think he changes his view on this, and I was really thinking of the later philosophy. But saying he changes his view, it's not really quite as simple as that, as it never is with the Tractatus, certainly according to we resolute readers. Wittgenstein's use of the term natural science in the Tractatus is to say the least, unusual, and runs the risk of being a kind of over-expanded or over-assimilating use. I think, this would take a long time to go into really, but I think a full understanding of what happens in the Tractatus, including what he actually means by throwing away the ladder, would in a certain sense kind of remove that impression again of an over-expanded projection of the term natural science. So in a certain sense, I don't think we should read too much into the way which he calls psychology, or seems to assimilate psychology to the natural sciences in the Tractatus, because he assimilates, if you will, virtually everything to natural science in the body of the Tractatus before it then gets overcome. But yeah, what I had in mind was the way that Wittgenstein talks about psychology in the later work, where it's very clear that he, well, for example, in the great remark at the end of part 2 of the investigations, where he says that the barrenness of psychology is not to be explained by its being a young science. Rather, we have here experimental methods and conceptual confusions that pass one another by, problem and method pass one another by, and never really engage with each other. And his so-called philosophical psychology, among other things, is a sort of an outline of how one might proceed differently. The second question I'm hesitant to try to answer because it's so huge, but at a first pass, the concept of elucidation is an enormously important concept in the Tractatus, and insofar as it can be, which I think it can to some considerable extent, be sort of taken back to its etymology of shedding light and so on and so forth, then yes, I think it has a lot to do with what Wittgenstein means by talking about his philosophy later as being purely descriptive, because the point he's trying to elucidate is that this shedding of light is not to be assimilated to the kind of shedding of light that comes with a standard normal scientific explanation, but is rather the kind of shedding of light that you get, for example, in Eliot's 4 quartets, where he says the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. It's a question of being able to take one's foggy spectacles off and clean them up, or to be able to appreciate for the first time that one's been seeing through spectacles or something like that, rather than to see and be able to explain what was in front of one using the kind of methods that a scientist would. So I hope that answers the question. I think there is, in that sense, a connection that can be drawn, if you like, between the role that the concept of elucidation plays in the early work and the role that the concept of description plays in the later work. And it's really, really important to understanding this, I believe strongly, to be clear that when Wittgenstein talks in the earlier work about climbing the ladder, he isn't really talking about arriving somewhere different from where you were before. It is a kind, you could think of it as a kind of Escherian ladder, which takes you back to where you started. And that would, I think, be a more helpful way of understanding it. That's one of the main things that we Resolute readers are trying to suggest is crucial to understanding the way that the Tractatus works.
Okay, we had a couple on this side of the room, but before then we had one right at the back, and I'm afraid I've lost track.
Yes. So, I very much appreciate your talk. If I can try to sum very quick now. So, in the first
Why don't you stand up?
Okay. The main part of your talk was about Wittgenstein ideas about science and criticisms, and it was very interesting. And then you concluded with today exaggerated scientism, and I'm not sure if I can get the link between the two, because so first I would say, for example, the idea that Wittgenstein had of science is something like method of science is method of reducing the explanation of natural phenomena to the smallest possible number of primitive laws. So I think this is one idea of science that maybe is not, for example, today, much of biology or even parts of physics are not to be intended. I mean, I don't know if Wittgenstein recognized this as the problem. And also, I think he was more concerned about applying this idea of science to philosophy or to other ways of thinking. So I was worried about that philosophers try to imitate it. But I don't know anything about his idea about when scientism is widespread in popular culture or public policy, things that you mentioned.
Okay, well, I'm not totally sure I got the question, but just to start with where you ended there, I think it's pretty clear that Wittgenstein was concerned about the extent to which scientism and related phenomena were influential in our civilization, which, by the way, it's worth noting, he tended to call a civilization not a culture, because he thought that, unfortunately, we didn't deserve the honorific epithet of being a culture. But that actually partly expresses the very point, right? Again, one might tie this to something like the famous anecdote of his comparing images of great composers such as Beethoven with images of great contemporary scientists, and saying, look, there seems to have been a cultural decline here. And I think it's very clear, going back to what you were saying earlier in your question, that Wittgenstein was concerned about the way, well, let's take an example. So behaviorism. So Wittgenstein writes a lot against behaviorism, seeking to explicate in a philosophical fashion what's wrong with behaviorism. I think he did this because behaviorism was a very influential thought current in his time. Right? And if it had been a less influential thought current, and if some form of cognitivism, something like the views of Jerry Fodor or somebody, had been more influential in his time, I think he would have focused more of his fire on that. Yeah. Now, how does this connect with our time? So behaviorism is much less influential as a current of thought in our time. It hasn't gone at all. In fact, it's present a lot more widely than people think. For example, it's very widespread in economics. Yeah. So I think in that way, behaviorism has kind of gone underground. And in some ways, Wittgenstein's critique of behaviorism is more timely now than it's ever been. But as I say, there are other currents of thought, more cognitivistic, etc., which have risen more to the fore and are more paradigmatically, if you will, dominant. And the contemporary task of the anti-scientistic Wittgensteinian philosopher is therefore to direct one's fire more to those. And so you asked what was the link between what I saw in Wittgenstein's quotations and my final somewhat polemical remarks about our contemporary situation. I was simply trying to say it would be a serious mistake to think that these dictums, the ones I have on the handout, etc., were of merely historical interest. Many of them are current in themselves, if you will, and insofar as they aren't, insofar as there's been a kind of a problem shift or an agenda shift or something, then what we need to do is, if you will, to take the spirit of these ideas and find how to apply them to the problems that are distinctively the philosophical problems, if you will, of our time.
I think time for one more question. I was just going to ask you about what you said in Gilchrist, which I couldn't quite grasp what you were implying. Whether it was an example of scientism or science, or how you viewed it.
Yes, sorry if I wasn't clear. So let me briefly respond to that. And I've done a review of Ian's book for the journal Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences, if anyone's interested. And there's also a version of it on my Talking Philosophy blog. So in brief, you're quite right. I think that there is, well, let's put it this way. Some people reading Ian McGilchrist's book from a Wittgensteinian perspective would be or are troubled. And they think, why is he talking so much about the brain? Isn't this kind of antithetical to Wittgenstein's approach? Is there a kind of scientism here in the way he's putting kind of neurology or neurophilosophy or something up front? My own view is more charitable than that. I think that what Ian is doing in his book is drawing on people such as Wittgenstein and Heidegger and Wordsworth and all sorts of people in a brilliant and polymathic way, as well as drawing upon some interesting results which Wittgensteinians shouldn't set their face against because they're results that come from science, from neurology. I think what Ian is doing is drawing these together to make a powerful cultural critique, which is, I think, highly consonant with the kind of cultural critique that I suggested was implicit in Wittgenstein's own work. And that cultural critique is to suggest that we have become dominated to such an extent that we don't even recognize this domination by scientific and technocratic ideals. And these have in particular suborned, as he demonstrates and goes through one by one and leads up to a kind of summation at the end of his book, these have in particular suborned all the kinds of forces or currents in our society which might make it possible to resist this domination. And this is why I think, for example, it becomes, when one says to people now something like, have you considered the possibility that looking at the evidence might not be the best way of solving this problem? They just look at you like you're some kind of moron or idiot. You know, they don't understand what you're talking about. So in particular, one after another, McGilchrist shows how we have culturally derogated and placed in a position of inferiority to our icon of science, a relationship to the land or to the earth, art and the arts, religion and spirituality. And what's so exciting and intriguing about this, as I say, is that he does this partly by making a kind of alliance between these things, between great poets and great philosophers, and an interpretation of the most up-to-date contemporary results in neurology and in neurophysiology. So I think it's a very intriguing work. I'm not claiming it's a perfect work, but I think it's a work that embodies the spirit of Wittgenstein, that has an interesting relation to our topic in terms of the way that it's very much opposed to scientism, while actually drawing on and in alliance with that all the best that science has to offer. Hope that explains what I meant.
Good. Well, our time has run out, I'm afraid. But many thanks to Rupert for a really stimulating talk and fascinating discussion period. And my apologies to those people who wanted to ask questions, but we afraid we haven't got time for
There might be another opportunity at the end of the day when I'll be back to try to draw things together.
Okay. And in the meantime, let us thank Rupert.
Thank you.